Welcome to the deep dive. If you're like us, you probably feel that the world's biggest problems, you know, climate change, systemic inequality, ecological collapse, they need more than just small tweaks.
Right, more than just incremental solutions.
Exactly. They seem to require a really fundamental shift in how we even think about reality itself.
That's a huge challenge.
It is, and that's exactly what we're tackling today. We are diving into this massive theoretical study. It's frankly breathtaking in its scope.
Which one is this?
It's called The River's Voice Through General World Theory, and it's not really a report just about one river.
No, it sounds much bigger.
Oh, it is. It feels like a report on existence itself, but filtered through, well, the ultimate witness to constant change, the river.
That's a powerful metaphor, using the river as a lens.
It really is.
Yeah.
So our mission today, it's ambitious. We're going to try and dissect this general world theory, the GWT framework.
Okay.
We'll do it by systematically exploring its 9 interconnected dimensions. These cover being, knowing, and action.
Right, the core components.
And the framework basically argues that if we can fundamentally change our theory of the world,
Then we can actually change the outcomes, the real world results.
that's the core idea.
And that philosophical leap, that's really the key here. The study makes this argument that the global crises we see,
Like-
well, whether you look at the Colorado River Delta basically drying up,
Yeah.
or the disastrous pollution of the Ganges,
Mm-hmm.
these aren't just failures of infrastructure.
Not just technical problems.
Exactly. Not just technology failing us. They're symptoms of something deeper. A profound theoretical error, you could say.
An error in how we understand things.
Yes, a failure in how humanity fundamentally understands existence, how we understand knowledge, and, crucially, ethical responsibility.
Wow, so the roots go really deep.
They do. The GWT, it posits that the world isn't just, a collection of separate objects out there waiting for us to manage them.
Right, not just resources to be cataloged.
Precisely. It argues the world is inherently dynamic, always changing. It's relational, everything's connected. And it's plural. Multiple truths, multiple realities exist side by side.
Okay, dynamic, relational, plural.
And because of that, it demands a different approach to understanding. It needs to be transdisciplinary, crossing boundaries. It needs to be situated, rooted in context,
Yeah.
and constantly evolving. Our understanding has to evolve. So these 9 dimensions, they're essentially the architectural blueprint for moving beyond these destructive, single-truth, human-centered ways of seeing the world.
So it's like if we keep using the wrong map, we're just going to keep getting lost. Is that the idea?
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
So, okay, let's try and discard that old map. Let's start building the new one using this GWT framework. If you, listening, want a shortcut to understanding this complex architecture of sustainable thought, well, this deep dive might just be it. So to begin, we absolutely have to talk about the core premise, the philosophical position that grounds this entire theory.
Right.
The authors start by adopting what they call the viewpoint of the river. What does that actually mean? For us to intellectually adopt the viewpoint of, like, a flowing body of water.
It's really the cornerstone of the whole GWT. It's an essential epistemological stance, a way of knowing.
Okay.
It demands that we treat rivers not as these passive, quantifiable objects, like pipelines for water extraction, or just lines on a map defining borders.
Things to be measured and controlled.
Exactly. Instead, we need to see them as active participants, as witnesses, even as subjects within these vastly complex systems. Socio-ecological, even spiritual systems.
Why the river, though? What makes it such a good viewpoint?
Well, the river is kind of the perfect vantage point because it inherently resists being reduced to just one single disciplinary silo.
Interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. A river is simultaneously a geological force, right? Cutting through bedrock over millennia.
Sure.
But it's also a living, breathing ecosystem sustaining incredible biodiversity.
Okay, geology, ecology.
Then it's often an economic artery, providing resources, transport, commerce.
Got it.
Can be a political boundary, defining nations, sometimes being a source of conflict.
True.
And very often, it's also a sacred entity, embodying profound spiritual meaning for communities.
Right, so it exists in all these dimensions at once.
Exactly. It resists being just one thing.
I see. So the act of trying to manage a river using only one lens, say a purely engineering lens that only sees water flow in cubic feet per second for hydropower.
Right. Maximizing one metric.
That approach automatically generates a fundamentally distorted understanding. Is that it?
That's precisely it. And that distortion, that's what leads to system failure, eventually.
Because you ignored the other dimensions.
Yes. The moment you define the river purely as, say, hydroutility, you completely ignore its role as fish habitat or as a spiritual artery for a local culture. Any single disciplinary framework inevitably leads to a kind of reductionist violence against the true, multifaceted nature of the phenomenon.
So the core challenge here, it sounds like, is abandoning this myth of the detached observer.
That's central. The idea that we can stand outside of reality, study it objectively, and then just issue some universal management plan from on high.
Yeah, that view from nowhere.
The river, with its complexity, its constant flow, it just demonstrates that reality is far more complex, far more plural, and deeply relational than any fixed blueprint can possibly account for.
It really is the ultimate reality check then. It basically says you can't solve the crisis of the Colorado River, for instance,
Right.
until you fully acknowledge that the engineers, the economists, the local indigenous communities, and the fish, they all have legitimate, often conflicting but coexisting truths about what that river actually is.
That's it, exactly. You have to hold all those truths together.
And that requires a new way of thinking, a new theoretical scaffolding to manage those simultaneous truths.
A new framework. Which brings us back to GWT.
Okay, let's unpack this GWT framework then, piece by piece. You mentioned the 9 dimensions. They're grouped into 3 conceptual families that basically cover existence itself.
That's right. Being, knowing, and action integration.
Okay, so we'll start by defining existence with being, which includes interdependence, pluralism, and becoming.
The fundamental nature of reality.
Then we move into how we grasp existence with knowing. That's relational knowing, entanglement, and contextuality.
How we understand that reality.
And finally, the ethical obligations that flow from those realities in action. Nonfinality, ethical praxis, and transversality.
How we should act within that reality.
Right. Let's dive deep. Okay, dimension 1. This feels like the bedrock of the whole theory. Interdependence. The definition given is that all beings, systems, and truths are interconnected and actively co-arising. What exactly does GWT mean by co-arising?
Interdependence is really the foundational ontology of GWT. It's the essential truth, they argue, of how the world is. And co-arising means systems aren't just linked, like gears in a clock that influence each other. It's deeper than that.
Oh, so?
It means they actively constitute one another. They bring each other into being, in a way. The river's physical existence, for example, is shaped by the human conceptual frameworks imposed on it, and vice versa. They emerge together.
So they're not separate things interacting, they're part of one process.
Exactly. A study uses this term, refers to the river as a hyper-object.
A hyper-object, what's that?
It's a concept suggesting that the physical reality, the water volume, the sediment deposition, the ecology of the river, it continuously co-rises with and is immediately influenced by the cultural stories, the technical theories, the legal frameworks that humans impose on it.
So you can't separate the physical river from, say, the political ideology of controlling it.
You really can't. They are entangled from the start. They co-create each other.
Okay, so let's look at that in action, maybe the negative side of interdependence, particularly when humanity tries to impose control. What happens when engineers attempt to, quote, normalize a wild river?
Right. Well, when modern interventions like massive dams, canals, levees are built specifically to normalize river flow for human purposes.
Like reliable shipping channels or maximum hydropower?
Exactly. Those actions demonstrate negative interdependence very clearly. The technical theory of control, designed to maximize one specific human utility, it directly alters the complex systemic reality of the river in ways that often weren't intended or were ignored.
And the result?
Well, the result is often catastrophic for the wider system. The engineering goal controlling the flow, it leads to blocking fish migration, altering sediment load that's essential for coastal ecosystems downstream, destroying habitats.
So the solution creates new, bigger problems.
Precisely. The engineering theory, the attempt to stabilize one variable, ends up destabilizing the entire interconnected system. It's a closed loop where the human intervention creates a negative ecological reality.
That makes a chilling amount of sense. And the Amazon basin must be the ultimate test case for this kind of global interdependence, right? It's so vast and complex.
Oh, absolutely. It's described in the study as the ultimate living web of co-arising systems.
A living web.
Think about it. The Amazon's hydrology its incredible climate regulation capacity, those flying rivers of moisture. It creates its staggering biodiversity and the human cultures living there, particularly indigenous systems of knowledge and land management.
They're all linked?
They're all profoundly mutually dependent. They form this vast self-organizing system that operates way beyond national boundaries.
And indigenous knowledge is key there.
Very key. The indigenous lifeways, particularly, often reflect a kind of relational intelligence that's deeply attuned to the inner being of soil, water, plants, spirit. A truly non-reductive view. So when that system gets degraded, say by deforestation or mining driven by external economic demands,
Yeah.
the consequence isn't just local habitat loss. It signals a potential systemic unraveling that impacts global climate stability.
Wow.
So interdependence, in this view, becomes more than just a fact. It's an ethical structural foundation for resilience, because that deep connection implies inescapable responsibility.
That's a crucial insight. Responsibility is actually baked into the nature of existence itself. Okay, let's move to dimension 2, pluralism. This dimension states that no single worldview, no single method, no single system can fully explain or sustainably govern the world.
Right. Pluralism confronts this profound tension that's created when multiple, often contradictory systems all claim authoritative truth over the same reality.
And the Ganges River example here is, well, it's gut-wrenching, isn't it?
It's probably the most agonizing example of this clash. It perfectly illustrates the problem.
So you have the scientific truth of pollution versus the deep spiritual truth existing side by side on the same sacred river. How does GWT suggest we even begin to manage that kind of conflict?
Well, you have these two utterly contradictory realities operating simultaneously. On one hand, the religious truth holds the sacred belief that the Ganges water, the Ganga Mata, under no circumstances can become impure.
A profound belief.
Absolutely. And this belief permits, even encourages, rituals like idol immersion, disposal of human remains, bathing, all directly in the river.
Okay, and the other side?
Simultaneously, you have the scientific ecological truth, the measurements, the data showing these very practices lead to catastrophic degradation, dangerously high levels of fecal coliform, heavy metals, industrial waste.
So the spiritual truth actively facilitates the material degradation.
Right. While the ecological data fundamentally threatens the spiritual integrity and meaning of the river for millions, it's a direct clash of truths.
It seems like total policy paralysis. You can't just tell millions of faithful that their deeply held beliefs are wrong based on water chemistry reports.
No, you can't.
But you also can't just ignore the massive public health crisis and ecological disaster created by the pollution. So how does GWT recommend bridging a gap where the core beliefs seem mutually hostile?
It argues that the solution isn't to choose one truth and try to destroy the other. That rarely works and causes immense harm.
Okay.
Instead, the path forward involves active reconciliation and, importantly, co-authorship of solutions, finding ways to respect both truths while mitigating the harm.
Co-authorship.
This necessity for pluralistic approaches is also really visible in somewhere like the Sahel region of Africa. It's shaped by immense cultural diversity. You've got indigenous groups, nomadic peoples, Islamic traditions, Christian influences, the legacies of colonialism, post-colonial states.
A real mosaic of worldviews.
Exactly. So consider a core disagreement, like you mentioned earlier. If a nomadic Islamic group has a fundamentally different understanding of land ownership and temporality,
Right.
then a centralized post-colonial state that's using a Western legal framework based on fixed property lines, how do they govern shared resources, like water or grazing land?
The technical challenge just seems immense. If, say, Durgan cosmology defines land relationally through ancestors and rituals, and a European-derived legal system defines it abstractly through title deeds and maps, how do you practically reconcile those fundamentally different ontologies? They're describing different worlds.
GWT suggests that pluralism reframes these tensions. Instead of seeing them as inevitable conflict or just a failure of everybody to agree, it sees them as potential opportunities for innovation, for creating something new that respects both realities. Sustainable governance, therefore, must be culturally situated and co-authored, meaning the rules for water use, for example, have to be developed together by both the centralized state authorities and the local community authorities, drawing on both scientific reports and traditional relational knowledge systems.
So it's not imposing one system over the other.
Exactly. The failure of so many development projects, particularly in places like the Sahel, often stems from imposing a single, supposedly universal, Western rational model onto a pluralistic reality.
Right.
Pluralism demands that all these divergent yet legitimate worldviews are structurally embedded in the governance process. We have to embrace the contradictions, the complexities created by things like colonial-era borders or clashing development paradigms. It's messy, but necessary.
That feels like a really important point, which moves us nicely to dimension 3, becoming. This is the idea that the world is dynamic, it's unfolding, it's constantly in transformation. This challenges the whole idea that reality can ever be fixed or static.
Precisely. If we think of the river again as our guide, the constant is the flow, the continuous emergence.
Change is the only constant.
Kind of, yeah. The human systems we build, science, law, religion, they're like the banks of the river, trying to contain that flow, to channel it, to make it predictable. But reality itself, the flow, is relentless. The banks are constantly shifting, they're eroding, sometimes they're breached entirely by floods. So reality, DWT argues, must be understood as this process of continuous emergence. It's never finished.
So stability, then, is kind of an illusion, or at least something maintained only by constant provisional effort, not a natural state.
That's a good way to think about it, yes.
How does this demand for continuous emergence translate into designing governance systems, if everything's always changing?
It fundamentally necessitates governance that is intensely adaptive. It has to be designed to evolve alongside its environment. Policy can't be seen as a final solution. It has to be provisional, always open to revision.
Always in beta, maybe.
In a sense, yes. Always ready for the next version. We see this need acutely in the Arctic Circle. It's ground zero for Arctic amplification.
Warming much faster than the rest of the planet.
Right, 2 to 4 times faster than the global average. This incredibly rapid environmental transformation is reshaping ecosystems, shipping routes, geopolitical stability almost month by month, it seems.
That must be incredibly challenging for policymakers.
It is, because they have to operate amid profound scientific uncertainty. Projections for critical things like permafrost thaw, for instance, they range wildly. Some say 10%, others up to 40% melt over the next couple of decades.
So you can't wait for the definitive, final scientific answer before acting.
Exactly. You simply can't wait. You have to govern amid deep ambiguity, building systems that can adapt as the knowledge evolves.
And if we look at a different kind of transformation, maybe a social innovation-driven one, Silicon Valley seems to operate on this idea of constant becoming, right? But maybe with significant ethical fallout sometimes.
Absolutely. Silicon Valley is a perfect illustration of becoming as this historically layered co-created transformation, from orchards and agriculture to this global tech hub.
Right.
Its economic success is entirely reliant on this highly dynamic innovation ecosystem that prizes disruption, experimentation, constant feedback loops, always searching for the next big thing.
The essence of move fast and break things.
Pretty much. However, that relentless drive for emergence, for the next new thing, has often dramatically outpaced the ethical governance needed to manage its consequences.
Such as?
Well, massive social challenges like housing crises, widening inequality, the societal impacts of the technologies themselves. The governance structures were often static, designed for the agricultural or early industrial era, maybe.
And they just failed to evolve.
They failed to evolve with the emergent reality of the information age that Silicon Valley itself was creating.
So this is where we really see the core insight of becoming crystallized. Governance systems themselves have to be explicitly designed to evolve.
Yes. Policy can't be treated as a fixed blueprint you issue and then defend. It has to be provisional, it has to be reflexive, capable of absorbing constant, sometimes disruptive, change through continual iteration, learning, and adjustment.
It's governance that is intentionally anti-dogmatic, in a way, always ready to question itself.
That's a very good summary of it, yes.
That dynamic notion of existence, of becoming, leads us straight into how we actually know the world, starting with dimension 4, relational knowing. This asserts that knowledge isn't abstract or universal, but it's situated in relationships.
Yes, situated in relationships between the observer and the observed, and also between culture and context.
So GWT is really challenging that Enlightenment idea of objective, universal knowledge.
Fundamentally challenging it. It states that knowledge is always contingent. It depends on the observer's physical, psychological, and importantly, cultural vantage point. To truly know something, GWT argues, you need to be in the correct relational position to it.
The correct relational position. I think the architectural analogy they use is probably the most accessible way to grasp this. It's about perspective, literally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The study points to those colossal statues of Ramesses the Great at Abu Simbel in Egypt.
Okay.
If you approach them from the wrong angle, or if you view them from too close up, they actually appear distorted. The proportions look wrong, foreshortened. The perfection of the face, the intended artistic truth of the statue, is only correctly apprehended, only truly seen, when the observer occupies one single precise point where the ancient sand slope met the northern buttress of the temple.
So there was one specific spot to stand to see it correctly?
Exactly. And that physical truth serves as a metaphor for relational knowing in general. Truth is real. It's not just relative, anything goes. But it is contingent upon you being in the right relation to the object of knowledge. Your position matters.
Okay, that makes sense physically. But when you apply that idea to social dynamics, the relational position gets much more complex. It's defined by things like power, history, social role.
Absolutely. And this is where the truth can become highly personalized, contested, and complex.
This study uses the example of coastal Louisiana oystermen, right?
Yes, it's a powerful example. When the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries banned the use of traditional hand dredges for oystermen, a policy described in official terms as impartial environmental protection.
Seemed neutral enough on the surface.
Right. But black oystermen in those communities frequently perceived that very same regulation not as objective necessity, but as blatant racial discrimination.
Why the disconnect?
Because their knowledge, their understanding of environmental protection was situated within a long, painful historical context of systemic discrimination that had consistently privileged white commercial fishing interests over their traditional practices.
Ah, okay.
So for those marginalized communities, the ban wasn't just about oysters and dredges. It felt like merely the latest iteration of policy, using seemingly neutral environmental language to reinforce historical power imbalances. Their specific relational position as historically marginalized actors defined what they perceived as the truth of that policy.
That is profound. It really demonstrates that you cannot divorce a policy decision or even a piece of data from the social relationships and histories that define the knower. Their context shapes their truth.
Precisely. Which takes us to the Nordic countries, which the study holds up as demonstrating how high levels of trust actually define and enable a positive kind of relational knowing and governance.
How does trust play into it?
Well, the Nordic model is often seen as excelling at relational knowing. Their governance systems, which are often highly effective, particularly in areas like sustainability and social welfare, are built upon a foundation of pervasive social trust.
Right, high trust societies.
Yes, and shared cultural kinship, traditions of consensus-driven decision-making, bottom-up reforms. This intense social capital, this trust, is the relational foundation that makes their policies effective and resilient. People tend to believe the system is working for the common good.
So the insight here is?
The insight is that when trust, care, and cooperation are high, the perceived distance between the governed and the governance shrinks. The relational position becomes more optimal for both parties to accept and implement policy decisions. It's based on connection, not just abstract rules.
Which fundamentally challenges those top-down, detached technocratic models that prioritize abstract metrics over actual human connection and trust.
Exactly. Trust becomes a core infrastructure for knowing and acting together.
Okay, let's move to dimension 5, entanglement. This one feels maybe the most philosophically challenging. The idea that the material, the mental, the social, and the spiritual are not separate domains, but are inherently entangled and inseparable.
Yes, this dimension really requires us to resist that ingrained habit of reductionist logic, of carving reality up into neat, separate boxes.
Like economics over here, culture over there.
Exactly. GWT argues that reality is actually composed of these relational forces where material flow like a river, mental models or ideas about it, cultural symbols, its sacredness, and political dynamics who controls it are not separate departments in a university.
They're all one system.
They're one indivisible co-constitutive system. They shape each other constantly.
The study uses ancient Egypt and the Nile, again, as a prime historical example of this entanglement.
It's perhaps the clearest example. Their entire cosmology was wholly entangled with the physical reality of the river.
How did the physical direction of the Nile's flow actually determine their spiritual beliefs and even their material structures, like tombs and temples?
It's fascinating. The ancient Egyptians observed the sun god, Ra, traversing the sky daily. Born in the east, dying in the west each evening as he set over the Nile Valley.
Okay, a physical observation.
Yes. And this physical fact, the sun setting over the western desert across the Nile, directly shaped their spiritual geography. East became the land of birth, life, growth. West became the land of death, transformation, resurrection.
Wow. So the physical landscape shaped the spiritual map.
Completely. And then this mental and spiritual geography directly determine their social and material reality. All the temples celebrating life and the gods were built on the east bank of the Nile.
Right.
And all the tombs, the pyramids, the necropolises, places dealing with death and the afterlife were built on the west bank.
Always on the West Bank.
Always. The spiritual belief structure dictated architecture, city planning, funerary practices. The material and the spiritual domains weren't separate. They were utterly entangled, co-creating a cohesive, incredibly resilient civilization that lasted for millennia.
That's amazing. Applying that entanglement idea to a massive modern construction, like the European Union, starts to reveal why its success or failure relies on much more than just economics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The EU can be seen as this huge, transformative, living regional experiment, and it really has to be understood through this lens of entanglement to make sense.
Okay.
Its ongoing function depends on the inseparable integration of at least four dimensions. There's the material, the single market, GDP, the euro, infrastructure.
Intangible stuff.
Right. Then there's the mental things like collective memory, shared educational values, a sense of European identity.
Ideas and beliefs.
Then the symbolic, the flag, Europe Day, the anthem, shared cultural touchstones.
The things that represent Europe.
And finally, the political, the complex, multi-level governance structure, the parliament, the commission, the treaty.
Okay. Material, mental, symbolic, political, all entangled.
Deeply entangled. If the economic system, material, struggles, the political entanglement is immediately strained.
Yeah.
But crucially, if the symbolic dimension fails, if citizens stop believing the shared narrative of Europe, if that identity phrase,
Yeah.
then the political and material project could unravel, regardless of GDP figures. The symbols and narratives aren't just decoration for policy, they embody the shared identity that structures public imagination and makes integration possible. Resilience depends on integrating all four dimensions.
So the key takeaway from entanglement is that sustainable regionalization, or maybe any large-scale project, is fundamentally an experiential and symbolic process, not just a technical one.
Exactly. Policy needs to engage matter and meaning, systems and stories, equally. You can't separate them without losing something vital.
Okay. Dimension 6 is contextuality. This means meaning and truth are always shaped by context, historical context, ecological context, linguistic, cultural, all of it.
That's right.
And this demands that sustainability has to emerge as a situated response to local realities. It can never be just an abstract, one-size-fits-all theory imposed from outside.
Exactly. GWT views regions and problems through their long memory. To understand the present state of something, you absolutely must understand the proper historical sequence that led to it.
A long memory.
The study uses another Egyptian analogy here, the progression of ancient Egyptian art and monuments. It only makes sense, you only grasp its development if you read it in sequence, chronologically.
From earliest to latest.
Right. If you start the latest monuments down in Nubia and try to work backward to the Old Kingdom pyramids near Cairo, you'll fail to grasp the historical logic, the evolution of their art and beliefs.
You lose the narrative thread.
Precisely. To properly contextualize a present truth, say, the current ecological status of the Nile, or a social issue along its banks, you have to acknowledge the order and the flow of history that created that present situation. The present is literally embedded in and determined by its long-term historical context.
And how does that long memory contextuality help illuminate a complex contemporary crisis, like the evolution of piracy off the Somali coast, that seemed to come out of nowhere for many people?
It didn't come out of nowhere, and that's the point of contextuality. The Somali coast provides this critical intersection of historical, ecological, and cultural contexts. Historically, it was a vital hub on the spice routes, a place of exchange.
Okay.
Ecologically, it boasts this unique bioregional setup, mangroves, coral reefs, crucial seasonal upwelling that supports rich fisheries.
Right.
And culturally, it has a long history of communal resource management, particularly of those fisheries.
So what happened?
Well, when modern piracy began to emerge and then escalate dramatically in the 2000s, it wasn't just a spontaneous outbreak of random criminality appearing in a vacuum. It evolved, at least initially, from a defensive response by local Somali fishers trying to fight back against illegal, unregulated, and unreported IUU fishing by large foreign industrial fleets who were decimating their traditional fishing grounds after the collapse of the Somali state.
So it started as kind of vigilante resource protection.
In many ways, yes. It was an act of desperation rooted in the historical context of maritime exploitation, and the immediate ecological crisis of depleted fisheries, coupled with the political context of state collapse. Only later did it morph into the more organized, internationally linked criminal enterprise focused on ransom.
So the cause of the current international crisis, the piracy that threatened global shipping, is historically contextualized by decades of foreign maritime exploitation and the collapse of local long-memory governance systems. You can't understand it without that history.
Exactly. And therefore, you cannot solve the piracy problem with purely military patrols or short-term economic aid packages alone. GWT would argue that true sustainability there depends on regenerating those local governance systems, supporting local livelihoods, and utilizing long-memory relational approaches that respect the historical context, rather than just imposing external governance templates.
Contextuality demands we center the specific distinct truths of place and their unique historical trajectories.
That's the core message. Context is everything.
Okay, that brings us to the final three dimensions of GWT, which seem to focus much more explicitly on the ethical practice and integration of all this. Starting with dimension 7, nonfinality. This is the idea that no theory of the world, no understanding can ever be complete, final, or closed.
Yes. Nonfinality is essentially the principle of intellectual humility, which GWT argues is essential for survival and adaptation in a complex, dynamic world.
Intellectual humility.
It means that our systems of knowledge, scientific, traditional, whatever, must be deliberately designed to expect new revelations, to anticipate needing perpetual revision. We have to avoid dogma at all costs.
That sounds like a tricky balance to strike, though. You need rigor and structure in your knowledge systems, otherwise anything goes. But you also need flexibility and openness to being wrong. Where does the strength or authority of knowledge come from if the theory is always provisional, always potentially wrong?
That's a great question. The strength comes not necessarily from the absolute certainty of the current theory, but from the rigor of the methodology used to arrive at it, and crucially, the built-in willingness to self-correct when new evidence emerges.
Okay.
Look at the history of Egyptology again. For centuries, the mystery of hieroglyphic writing remained totally insoluble. Why? Because scholars were trapped in the dogma, the fixed idea that every single sign had to be an abstruse symbol, a mystical or allegorical character.
They were reading it like a secret spiritual codebook.
Exactly. And they got nowhere. The breakthrough with Champollion came from shattering that dogma, from entertaining the possibility, and then proving that the signs were actually mainly alphabetic and syllabic, part of a functional language system.
Right, a different kind of system entirely.
That moment of intellectual revision, of abandoning the old final theory, opened up the entire field. It proved that scholarly progress absolutely requires recognizing that your best theory today is provisional and likely incomplete. You have to be willing to be wrong.
And the study provides a fascinating counterexample, though, from the Navajo tradition. It highlights how extreme rigor in transmission can maintain the stability needed to prevent knowledge from just dissolving into relativism.
Yes, that's the other side of the coin, the necessary balance. Navajo ceremonial knowledge, as described, demands incredible rigor in its transmission from one generation or practitioner to the next.
How so?
An error of even a single syllable in chanting a song or a mistake in a complex sand painting may be considered fatal to the efficacy of a ceremony. The power is in the precision.
Wow.
This highly complex, non-negotiable form, the exact words, the exact patterns, serves to validate the system's authority and prevent it from arbitrary dissolution or casual change.
So how does that fit with non-finality? It sounds quite final.
In GWT terms, you could see it this way. Rigorous form, like the precise ceremony or the scientific method, anchors belief and practice, providing stability against chaos. But intellectual humility, like shattering the old hieroglyphic dogma, or maybe adapting a ceremony slightly based on new revelation within the tradition, allows the core understanding to evolve when necessary.
Okay, so they're both mechanisms of non-finality in a way. One provides stability through form, the other allows change through openness.
That's a good way to see it.
They ensure the system remains both responsive and validated over time. It's not about being rigid, nor is it about anything goes.
And today, the Arctic Circle again serves as the ultimate contemporary case study in the necessity of non-finality because of that intense scientific uncertainty driven by climate change.
Absolutely. Policy in the Arctic must proceed with humility and be designed for adaptation because, as we said, the sea ice volume estimates vary by 50%. Permafrost projections range wildly.
The science is still evolving rapidly. Exactly. So policy has to be recursive, it has to be iterative. Governance in such a situation cannot credibly promise a fixed, predictable outcome based on today's knowledge. It has to promise a process of continuous adaptation and coevolution with environmental changes that are inherently ambiguous and non-final.
Okay, Dimension 8 is ethical praxis. This feels like one of the most profound ideas in GWT. How we describe the world actively shapes how we live in it. Therefore, creating world theories is inherently an ethical and performative act.
Yes, it's a cornerstone. Our ways of describing the world aren't just neutral labels we attach to a pre-existing reality. They are performative acts. They actively participate in shaping that reality.
Naming is destiny.
In a sense, yes. Description is an ethical commitment. Consider the Mississippi River again. When early European explorers called it the Great River, the Father of Waters, that very act of naming, that description, it served to legitimize a certain kind of interaction. Massive scale use, continental commerce, manifest destiny.
It framed it as something huge, powerful, and there for the taking almost.
Exactly. And that description, the river is primarily a commercial artery, coupled with the engineering goal of normalizing its unpredictable flow for navigational control.
Right, building the levees.
Led directly to the construction of those vast, complex systems of levees, locks, dams, and revetments. This engineering, driven by the description, successfully stabilized navigation and commerce for a time. But it also dramatically reduced the river's natural sediment output to the delta by some 60%, starved the wetlands, disconnected the river from its floodplain, creating a delta that is now rapidly sinking, incredibly vulnerable, and reliant on perpetual, increasingly costly human maintenance.
So the theory of control embedded in the description of the river as an object to be normalized for commerce literally manufactured the material world of perpetual instability and crisis we now inhabit along the lower Mississippi.
It's the crisis of modernity and microcosm right there.
Yeah.
The description created the reality, with all its unintended ethical consequences.
And we see the flip side of this, the tension between description and reality in modern urban development, too, like the example of the Suzhou New District, SND, in China.
Right. S&D is often described, particularly in official narratives and planning documents, as this shining model for high-tech urban development, for green cities, for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, at a local level.
That's the description.
That's the positive aspirational description. However, that glossy narrative often masks or downplays other realities happening on the ground.
Such as?
Things like significant social inequities, the marginalization or displacement of migrant workers who build the city but can't afford to live in it, and the inevitable environmental trade-offs involved in rapid industrialization and urbanization, like pollution or habitat loss.
So there's a gap between the official story and the lived experience.
There's often a gap. Ethical praxis, in the GWT sense, demands an open acknowledgement of this tension. It requires transparency about the gap between the glossy description, the SDG model city, and the complex, sometimes ethically fraught reality, which includes social displacement or pollution.
Why is acknowledging the gap so important ethically?
Because governance needs to promote reflexivity and accountability. It needs to align its description of the region, its goals, with the ethical reality it actually seeks to produce on the ground. That means making the trade-offs like growth versus equity or development versus environment visible and transparent, open for discussion.
This raises such an important question then. If our words, our descriptions, our theories literally help create our world, then the entire process of policy formulation, of planning, of even just talking about issues, it's fundamentally a moral act.
Precisely. We have a deep moral obligation to choose narratives, descriptions, and theories that consciously aim to promote resilience, justice, and sustainability, not just efficiency or control. Our words have power.
Which leads us perfectly to the final dimension, Dimension 9, transversality. This is the idea that real insight, true breakthroughs, often emerge not from within isolated silos or disciplines, but at the intersection between different domains.
Yes. Transversality is about the mandatory, deliberate crossing of boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, cultural boundaries, even ontological boundaries, different ways of being, in order to gain deeper insight.
And it resists epistemic hierarchy.
Crucially, yes. It resists the ingrained idea that certain ways of knowing, typically Western science, are inherently superior to others, like traditional ecological knowledge or artistic insight or spiritual understanding. Transversality values knowledge from all relevant sources.
Can you elaborate a bit on the difference between standard interdisciplinary work, which we hear a lot about, and GWT's concept of transversality? Is it just a fancy word for the same thing?
It's related, but I think transversality aims for something deeper. Interdisciplinarity often means different experts from different silos coordinating, maybe sharing data, but often still operating primarily within their own frameworks. Transversality implies actually dissolving the boundaries, creating something new at the intersection that wouldn't have been possible from within any single silo. It's about synthesis, not just cooperation.
Like the hieroglyphics example again.
Exactly. The breakthrough in reading Egyptian hieroglyphics required transversality. Scholars had previously been stuck using only philosophical dogma. Every sign is a symbol. The breakthrough came from crossing that dogma with rigorous, systematic linguistic analysis, treating it as a language.
Two different ways of knowing brought together.
Right. The new possibility, actually achieving fluency in understanding in ancient civilizations' texts, history, even medical treatises, emerged only through the synthesis of these previously separated, even conflicting fields. It proved that the most generative, transformative knowledge is often found right at the boundary where different methods, different worldviews, conflict or converge.
And culturally, the study suggests that the most critical ethical insights also arise when deeply held, perhaps conflicting, creeds or beliefs confront one another, right?
Absolutely. The study highlights this wonderful anecdote, I think. It's about cooperation between Protestant missionaries and Arab groups, where confronting their very real theological differences led them to a shared realization that, despite different names and rituals, both ultimately acknowledged the same great spirit, the same source of life.
And that led to a question.
It led to this profound ethical realization encapsulated in the simple, powerful question: shall we quarrel over the well upon the thirsty way, or shall we drink together and be thankful?
Wow, that cuts right through it.
Doesn't it? That simple question is the definition of ethical transversality in action. It's about crossing boundaries, doctrinal, cultural, in the service of mutual survival and shared humanity, prioritizing fundamental necessity and connection over rigid adherence to separate doctrines.
And the Great Barrier Reef, GBR, in Australia is held up as a fantastic, maybe more institutionalized, modern example of this kind of transversal approach in environmental governance.
Yes, the management of the GBR, at least in its ideal form, requires permanent transversal integration. It explicitly aims to integrate marine science, economic modeling, indigenous knowledge from the traditional owners of sea country,
Right.
and policy development into a unified co-governance framework. It's
Right.
not just consulting indigenous groups, it's embedding their knowledge and authority structurally.
And this structure supports what GWT calls epistemic justice.
Exactly. Epistemic justice means structurally valuing the jetty narrow port. Traditional owners' deep, long-term knowledge of their sea country equally with university-based scientific data or economic reports. Not treating one as real knowledge and the other as cultural belief.
Why is that equal valuation so important?
Because GWT argues it's absolutely essential for building adaptive capacity and legitimacy in governance. When you resist epistemic hierarchy, when you practice transversality, you mobilize all the available knowledge sources relevant to a complex problem like managing a reef. This makes the governance system inherently stronger, more resilient, and more responsive to the complex, multidimensional reality of the reef itself.
Okay, so we've journeyed through all 9 dimensions of GWT, covering existence, knowledge, and ethical action. Now let's try to synthesize this. If these 9 dimensions are the scaffolding, what is the resulting architectural structure of governance that GWT calls for? What does it look like in practice?
Well, fundamentally, GWT demands a radical reframing of governance itself. It's arguing that governance isn't just technical management or bureaucratic administration.
It's more than that.
Much more. It's conceived as a living, cultural, and deeply ethical infrastructure.
Okay, and structurally?
Structurally, it must be polycentric. That means power needs to be distributed across multiple, overlapping, often nested levels of authority: local, regional, national, transnational.
Yeah.
Not concentrated at the top.
Distributed power. And
Ends be hybrid. It needs to actively, intentionally blend different knowledge systems and governance traditions, indigenous ways, communal practices, perhaps religious ethical frameworks, alongside scientific findings and state regulations.
like the examples of the Arctic Council or the kind of model needed for the Sahel.
Exactly. Those are attempts or requirements for that kind of polycentric hybrid structure that can actually handle the pluralistic reality on the ground.
This movement away from traditional hierarchical top-down control towards what the study calls relational governance, it feels quite radical. How does that translate to action on the ground? What does relational governance do differently?
Relational governance is explicitly grounded in things like trust, mutual responsibility, and moral accountability qualities often missing in purely technocratic systems.
Right.
It aims to operationalize the dimensions of pluralism and interdependence by ensuring that diverse worldviews and knowledge systems aren't just consulted as an afterthought, but are structurally embedded in the actual decision-making process from the beginning.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Instead of, say, a national environmental ministry unilaterally defining the boundaries and rules for a new marine conservation zone based solely on scientific reports.
The standard approach, maybe?
Right. A relational governance model would require that zone to be co-defined. It would involve integrating the scientific data, yes, but also the experiential knowledge and economic needs of local fishers, that's relational knowing, and perhaps the spiritual significance of certain areas understood by local indigenous groups, that's entanglement and pluralism. The policy, the zone, only moves forward when the process itself embodies these multiple dimensions, builds trust, and achieves a negotiated outcome reflecting that hybrid reality.
So the process is as important as the outcome.
The process shapes the outcome and its legitimacy.
The study also forces us to fundamentally rethink the roles of the key actors in society. How does GWT redefine players like business, communities, even nature itself?
It really does shift the perspective. Under GWT, business, for example, must shift from a purely extractive logic, focused solely on maximizing shareholder value or resource extraction, towards becoming genuine ethical stewards.
Ethical steward.
Yes. Businesses need to see themselves and act as embedded co-creators of regenerative futures, fully recognizing their profound interdependence with the social and ecological systems they operate within. It's a much deeper responsibility.
And communities.
Communities move from being seen as passive recipients of policy or problems to be managed to being recognized as dynamic agents of governance themselves, holding deep ecological, historical, and cultural knowledge that is vital for resilience.
Empowering local knowledge.
Exactly. And perhaps most radically, nature itself must be recognized not just as a resource or a backdrop, but as an active political and moral actor in its own right.
Nature as an actor.
Yes.
Yep.
GWT fundamentally challenges anthropocentric or human-centered views. It insists on the need for reciprocal relationships between humans and the more than human world. This includes acknowledging the inherent rights and even the moral authority of entities like rivers, forests, ecosystems, an acknowledgement that needs to be legally and structurally binding, not just poetic.
Like the rights of nature movements we're seeing emerge.
Precisely. That aligns very closely with this GWT perspective.
And when we look at those complex, multidimensional regions we discussed, like Silicon Valley or the Amazon Basin, through this GWT lens, how does it help us define them? They resist easy categorization.
GWT defines them as hybrid ecosystems. They resist any singular definition, precisely because they are inherently multiscalar, operating at local, regional, global levels simultaneously and multidimensional, weaving together economy, culture, ecology, technology.
Okay.
They are characterized by that deep relational interdependence we talked about, and by ontological pluralism, different realities coexisting. Their stability, or lack thereof, arises not from rigid, top-down control, but from the complex, dynamic, constantly evolving interplay of all these entangled forces.
So you can't manage Silicon Valley purely as a technical innovation cluster, just like you can't manage the Amazon purely as a collection of trees and water requiring conservation.
Exactly. You need a framework that can grasp the hybridity, the entanglement, the constant becoming.
Finally, the overall moral architecture of GWT seems to center on justice, but also this concept of worlding. Justice is foundational, obviously, but GWT seems to expand its definition far beyond the traditional idea of just distributing resources fairly.
Yes, absolutely. GWT insists that justice itself must be understood as multidimensional. We definitely need distributive justice, the fair sharing of resources and opportunities, and we need procedural justice, fair processes in decision-making.
But GWT adds more layers.
Yes. It argues we must also structurally integrate. First, epistemic justice. This means the active, structural valuation of all legitimate knowledge systems equally. So indigenous knowledge isn't treated as folklore, but is valued on par with scientific data in relevant contexts. This is essential for practicing transversality effectively.
Valuing all ways of knowing. And the second edition.
Second, ontological justice. This involves fundamentally respecting relational worldviews and recognizing non-human agency. It means acknowledging that the river, the forest, the mountain has a legitimate inherent value and a moral reality independent of its utility to humans. This is crucial for enacting pluralism authentically.
Wow. epistemic and ontological justice. Those are big concepts. And worlding, what is that? Is that the practical framework for implementing this multidimensional justice?
Worlding is presented as the practical, ongoing framework for actually doing GWT. It's defined as the relational practice of narrating, making visible, and actively co-producing regions or the world as ethical and lived spaces.
So it's about actively creating the world according to these principles.
Exactly. It's how we embed these principles of multidimensional justice, complex identity, and participatory governance into the physical landscape, into our institutions, to our stories. Worlding is the ongoing, conscious effort to ensure that the moral architecture we build, guided by GWT, embeds more than human agency within governance. It recognizes that we are not the sole actors shaping the planet. It's the continuous collective process of creating a world that tries to honor all 9 dimensions simultaneously.
So GWT, at the end of the day, it's less about finding a specific silver bullet policy solution for any given problem.
Right. It's not a policy menu.
And more about creating a process, a kind of flexible, ethical infrastructure that's actually capable of handling the inherent complexity of relational, plural, and constantly changing existence.
Exactly. It provides the conceptual lens, the framework, to help us interpret these complex interdependencies, to navigate the inevitable conflicts arising from plural identities and truths, and to respond adaptively and ethically to constant change. It's really a guide to ethical world-making, not just resource management.
And it completely rejects that search for a universal template, a single best practice for sustainability that can just be rolled out everywhere. Instead, it insists that the quality of our shared future depends entirely on our capacity to hold competing truths together.
To constantly revise our own knowledge with humility.
And to fully acknowledge the deep ethical consequences of the worlds we choose to build through our theories and actions.
The ultimate lesson, perhaps, from the river's voice, channeled through this theory, is that reality isn't fixed. It's not something we just discover out there. It is a shared, continuous emergence that we are all participating in, consciously or not.
And the technical failures we see all around us globally, the drying rivers, the collapsing ecosystems, the social fractures,
They're simply mirrors, GWT would argue, mirrors reflecting the profound failure of our underlying theoretical understanding of the world and our place within it.
which leaves us with a final provocative thought. The ultimate question, posed by this way of thinking, seems to be not whether humanity can finally gain complete control over the ancient flow of rivers or nature itself,
A futile goal, perhaps.
but whether we can finally learn to participate wisely in their ancient wisdom, whether we can learn to flow with uncertainty, with complexity, rather than constantly struggling against it, and whether we can fully accept that our knowledge is always provisional, always situated, and always ethically consequential in the worlds we are actively, collectively building moment by moment.
A profound challenge indeed.